Imagine being 82 years old, standing in the doorway of your own bedroom, looking at three suitcases you did not pack. The zippers were closed, the corners were squared away with a neatness that felt like a verdict. On top of the biggest one sat a folder, laminated, tabbed, color-coded, with the name of a place you had never agreed to go. You had spent 40 acres of raising children in that house. You had buried your wife from that house. And now your own son was standing in the hallway, arms crossed, waiting for you to say thank you. That was the morning Harold Evans understood that his family had already made a decision about the rest of his life, and hadn't thought to ask what he wanted. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. My name is Harold Evans. I'm 82 years old, a widower, and a retired Army veteran. For most of my life, I lived in a modest two-story house on the edge of Kansas City, Missouri. The kind of house where you know exactly which stair creaks and which cabinet door needs a shove to close. I served 2 tours before I turned 25. I came home, married a woman named Doris, who could make a Sunday roast taste like a holiday, raised 2 children in that house, and worked 31 years at a manufacturing plant until my knees gave out before my mind ever did. Doris passed 6 years ago. Cancer. Quiet, and then not quiet, and then gone. After she died, the house got very loud in its silence, if that makes any sense. You don't realize how much sound another person makes just by existing in the next room. The clink of a coffee cup, the hum of the television from the kitchen, footsteps on the stairs, until all of it stops at once. I adjusted. I'm an old soldier. Adjusting is what we do. I kept the garden going, mostly tomatoes and a stubborn patch of okra. Doris always said I planted wrong. I drove myself to the VA for checkups. I called my daughter, Linda, every Sunday at 6, and my son, Mark, whenever something needed fixing that I could no longer fix myself, which, admittedly, was becoming more often. Then, on a Tuesday in early March, I fell. It wasn't dramatic. No cinematic tumble down a flight of stairs. I was reaching for a can of soup on the second shelf of the pantry. My sock caught the edge of the rug, and I went down hard on my hip. I lay there for 11 minutes before I managed to drag myself to the phone. 11 minutes. I counted them, staring at the ceiling, cursing myself for not wearing the emergency pendant Mark had bought me 2 Christmases ago. The one I kept in a drawer because I thought it made me look feeble. The hip wasn't broken, thank God. Just badly bruised, with some soft tissue damage that required physical therapy 3 times a week. But something else broke that day, something I couldn't see an x-ray of: my children's confidence in me. For 6 weeks I went to physical therapy at a clinic near my daughter's house. She'd insisted I stay with her during the worst of the recovery, and I hadn't fought her on it. Because frankly, 11 minutes on a kitchen floor takes something out of a man that even a soldier's pride can't fully replace. I assumed I was going home once I could walk without the cane. I was wrong. On the day I finally felt strong enough, the day I actually looked forward to sleeping in my own bed again, in my own house, with the creak in the 3rd stair, and the smell of Doris's old rose bushes drifting through the window, my son Mark drove me back to Kansas City. I remember the drive. I remember making a joke about finally getting my okra patch back in shape. Mark laughed, but it was a short laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. When we pulled into the driveway, something felt off before I even got out of the car. Linda's car was there too, and a small moving truck. I walked into my own home and found 3 suitcases packed and waiting by the stairs. Not my suitcases, new ones, sturdy, the kind you buy when you expect someone to be gone a long time. On top sat a laminated folder from a place called Brookdale Senior Living. My daughter was sitting at the kitchen table, my table, with paperwork spread out like she was closing a business deal. My son stood near the suitcases like a man guarding evidence. "Dad," Linda said, standing up too quickly, the chair legs scraping against the floor. "We need to talk. I want to be clear about something. My children are not cruel people. Linda has spent her whole adult life being the responsible one, the fixer, the one who shows up with a casserole and a spreadsheet. Mark has always been quieter, more avoidant of conflict. The kind of man who solves problems by making them disappear rather than discussing them. They loved me. I never doubted that for 1 second, not even in the moment I'm about to describe. But love, when it's frightened enough, starts making decisions on your behalf. And frightened people rarely think to ask the person they're protecting whether protection is what he actually wants. We toured Brookdale last week, Linda said, sliding the folder toward me like it was a peace offering. It's beautiful, Dad. They have a garden, a woodworking shop, bingo on Thursdays. I looked at the suitcases. I looked at my son, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at the folder with a photo of smiling, gray-haired strangers on the cover, none of whom looked like me, none of whom had ever dug a trench in the mud outside Da Nang, or held a newborn daughter in a hospital hallway, or built a treehouse with his own 2 hands in a backyard that had, apparently, already been decided against him. You already packed my bags, I said. It wasn't a question. We didn't know how else to bring it up, Mark said quietly. We were scared, Dad. 11 minutes. What if it happens again and nobody's there? I understood the fear. I do. I am not a man who pretends not to understand fear. I've felt genuine fear, the kind that empties your stomach, more times than I care to count. But there is a particular kind of pain that has nothing to do with the nursing home itself, and everything to do with what it represents. It wasn't the facility. It wasn't even the fall. It was the folder sitting on my own kitchen table, decided upon in rooms I wasn't in, discussed in phone calls I wasn't part of, agreed to before I ever had a chance to say a single word about my own remaining years. My life hadn't ended. But somewhere in that stack of paperwork, somebody had already written the last chapter for me. I sat down at the table. Not because I agreed with anything, but because my hip still hurt and I needed a moment before I said something I couldn't take back. Linda kept talking about liability insurance, about how the stairs in my own house were now considered a hazard, about a home health aide who could check in if I really wanted to stay, which even she said with the tone of someone who already assumed I'd choose the easier option. I stopped hearing the details after a while. What I heard underneath all of it was a sentence neither of my children would ever actually say to my face. Your life is basically over now, Dad. We're just handling the logistics. Nobody said that sentence. I want to be fair to them. Nobody would ever say something so brutal to a father's face. But it was there, folded into every laminated page, every casserole dish Linda had brought over, just in case. Every time Mark called me buddy instead of dad, the way you'd talk to someone you were trying to keep calm. I want you to understand something about growing old that nobody tells you when you're young and strong and certain your body will never betray you. The hardest part isn't the pain in your joints, or the doctor visits, or even losing the person you built a whole life with. The hardest part is watching people who love you slowly stop asking your opinion. It happens in small increments. First, they start finishing your sentences. Then they start making appointments without checking your calendar. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, you come home from physical therapy, and your entire future is packed into 3 suitcases sitting in your own hallway, and nobody in the room thought to ask you first. I looked at that laminated folder, Brookdale Senior Living, a name designed by a marketing committee to sound comforting, and I thought about Doris. I thought about the years we spent in that house. I thought about the war I survived, the plant floor I worked for 3 decades, the 2 children I raised who were now, with the very best of intentions, trying to put me somewhere quiet and safe and, functionally, out of the way. I need some air, I said, and I walked out to the backyard, past my ruined okra patch, and I sat on the bench Doris and I had bought at a flea market in 1987. That's where the idea started. Not fully formed. Just a crack of light through a door I didn't know was still there. Here is something I hadn't told my children, because frankly it hadn't seemed relevant until that exact moment. I had a war buddy named Ray Delgado who, 12 years earlier, had done something everybody in our old unit thought was borderline insane. At 68, after his wife passed, Ray sold his house in Tampa, packed 2 suitcases, his own suitcases, packed by his own hands, and moved to a place called Dumaguete in the Philippines. We used to write letters. Actual letters. The old kind. Because Ray never did trust computers. He'd tell me about mornings on his porch overlooking rice paddies, about a housekeeper named Marites who scolded him if he skipped breakfast, about neighbors who treated him like family within a month of arriving. He told me his pension, which barely covered his mortgage back in Florida, let him live like a wealthy man in the province, private caregivers if he ever needed them, a modest but comfortable home, warm weather that didn't punish his arthritis every winter. The last letter I got from Ray, about 8 months before that day in my kitchen, ended with a line I hadn't thought about in a while, until suddenly, sitting on that flea market bench, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Harold, I know this sounds crazy, but I've never felt more like myself than I do right now. Nobody here looks at me and sees an old man waiting to die. They just see a man. That night, after Linda and Mark left, after I told them, calmly, that I was not signing anything, that I needed time to think, and after Linda cried and Mark got quiet in that way that meant he was disappointed but wouldn't say so, I sat alone in my house for the first time in 6 weeks. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with Ray's old letters spread out in front of me. The same table where, hours earlier, my daughter had spread out brochures for a place designed to manage my decline. 2 futures were laid out on that same wood grain. One had bingo on Thursdays and a hallway with handrails. The other had rice paddies and a man who, according to his own letters, had never felt more like himself. I am not by nature an impulsive man. 31 years on a factory floor and 2 tours overseas teach you to think things through, to plan, to measure twice. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at Ray's handwriting, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going to Brookdale Senior Living, I was going to the Philippines. I want to be honest with you. The next morning, in the cold light of day, without the emotional charge of suitcases in my hallway, the idea seemed almost embarrassing. An 82-year-old man moving across the world alone, on the strength of some old war buddy's letters. But I didn't call Brookdale. And I didn't tell my children what I was thinking, not yet. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the library. The reference librarian, a patient young woman named Ashley, helped me set up an email account and pointed me toward expat forums where American and Canadian retirees discussed life in the Philippines in exhaustive, sometimes contradictory detail. For 3 weeks, I spent my mornings at that library, reading everything I could find. I learned that a modest but comfortable life in a place like Cebu or Dumaguete could cost a fraction of what an assisted living facility charged monthly back home, often less than a third. I learned about the Special Resident Retirees Visa, a program that allowed foreign retirees to live there long-term with relative ease, provided they met certain financial requirements. I learned that healthcare, while not identical to American hospitals, was often surprisingly affordable, and in the cities, quite modern. I also learned the parts nobody puts in the brochures. I read about retirees who'd been taken advantage of by unscrupulous property deals. I read about the loneliness some expats described in their first few months, the culture shock, the homesickness that hit hardest around the holidays. I read warnings about the heat, the humidity, the occasional power outages, the adjustment of no longer being surrounded by the familiar rhythms of American life. One post, from a woman named Carol who'd moved to Cebu after her husband died, stuck with me. She wrote, "It's not paradise. It's just life, somewhere else. But it's my life, and nobody here is waiting for me to need a wheelchair before they start treating me like I still matter." I called Ray. It took some doing. International calling cards, time zone math scrawled on a napkin. But I got him on the phone for the first time in years. "Harold Evans," he said, laughing before I even finished my sentence. "You're not calling to tell me you're moving here." "I might be." There was a pause. Then Ray, in the voice of a man who understood exactly what had brought me to this decision without me having to explain a single detail, said, "They tried to put you somewhere, didn't they?" They packed my bags before they asked me a single question. Yeah, Ray said quietly. That's usually how it goes. He told me the truth, unsentimentally, the way old soldiers talk to each other. It wouldn't be easy. I'd be far from my grandchildren. The bureaucracy could be maddening. I would, at times, feel like a stranger in a strange land, because I would, quite literally, be one. But he also told me something else. Harold, I go to sleep every night in a house I chose. I wake up every morning to a life I built, not one somebody else assigned me. At 68, I thought I was done being somebody. Turns out I was just done being somebody there. I hung up the phone and sat with that for a long time. I decided to tell Linda and Mark together, at my house, over coffee. Not over a brochure this time, but over my own kitchen table, on my own terms. I laid it out plainly. I was not moving to Brookdale. I had researched a retirement visa program in the Philippines. I had a friend already living there who could help me get settled. I intended to sell the house, invest the proceeds carefully, and use the income along with my pension to live comfortably somewhere I had actually chosen for myself. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I've experienced since Doris's funeral. Dad, that's... Linda started, then stopped. That's insane. You're 82. You fell down in your own kitchen 6 weeks ago. I fell down in my own kitchen because I wasn't wearing the pendant Mark bought me, I said. That's a decision I made, and I'll own it. But falling once doesn't mean my life is over. It means I need to be more careful. There's a difference. Mark, quieter than usual, finally spoke. Dad, we're not trying to punish you. We're scared. What if something happens and you're on the other side of the world? Something could happen to me tomorrow crossing the street outside this house, I said. I've buried friends who died safe in their own beds, surrounded by family, and I've known men who lived to 90 doing something everyone told them was reckless. Safety isn't the same thing as living, and nobody, including either of you, gets to decide which one I choose for myself, Linda cried. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where everyone claps and understands immediately. She felt, I think, like I was rejecting her care, rejecting the love behind those suitcases, even though the suitcases themselves had wounded me more than she ever intended. I held her hand across the table. Sweetheart, I know why you packed those bags. I know it came from love. But you didn't ask me. Nobody asked me. And I need, at least once more in my life, to be the one who decides where I sleep at night. It took weeks of hard conversations. There were tears. There was anger. There was a particularly difficult phone call where Mark accused me of abandoning the family, words he later apologized for. But eventually, something shifted. Not full agreement, Linda, to this day, still worries, but something closer to respect. The turning point came when I asked Linda a simple question. If I were 40 years younger and told you I wanted to move abroad for a new opportunity, would you call me insane, or would you call me brave? She didn't have an answer for that one. Selling the house was, unexpectedly, the hardest part. Every room held 40 years of a marriage. The kitchen where Doris taught our daughter to bake pie crust from scratch. The bedroom where both my children were conceived, and where Doris took her last breath 6 years earlier, my hand in hers. The backyard bench, the ruined okra patch, the stair that still creaked no matter how many times I'd meant to fix it. I walked through the empty rooms the day before closing, after the movers had taken what I was keeping and donated the rest, and I let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral. Not because I regretted the decision, I didn't, not for 1 second, but because leaving a place that held so much of a life is its own kind of grief, separate from and layered on top of everything else. I kept 1 box of Doris's things, her wedding ring, a handful of photographs, the recipe cards in her handwriting, and I carried it onto the plane with me rather than checking it, because some things you don't trust to cargo holds. The financial side, I'll admit, took some careful planning. I met with a financial advisor Mark insisted on, a decent man named Philip, who ran the numbers 3 different ways, before admitting, somewhat reluctantly, that the math actually worked. Between the proceeds from the house, my modest savings, and my monthly pension, I could live comfortably in the Philippines with a standard of living I could never have replicated in an American assisted living facility, and I'd have money left to travel, to help my grandchildren with college, to actually live rather than simply subsist. I still think it's risky, Philip said at our final meeting. Everything worth doing is risky, I told him. The question is whether it's the right risk. The morning I left, only Linda came to the airport. Mark and I had made our peace over the phone the night before, a long call where he finally said the thing I think he'd needed to say for weeks. I'm scared I won't see you again, Dad. You will, I told him. Just not across the street, across an ocean. There are planes for that. Linda hugged me at the gate longer than necessary, the way you hug someone when you're trying to memorize the feeling of their arms around you. Call me every Sunday, she said, like you always did. 6 o'clock your time, I said. I'll just have to do the math on my end now. I carried 2 suitcases onto that plane. Not the 3 that had been packed for me weeks earlier without my knowledge. Those had long since been returned, unused, to whatever closet in the universe holds discarded futures other people tried to assign us. These 2, I had packed myself, with my own hands, choosing every item with the deliberate care of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time in years, that he was still the author of his own story. The flight was long. Kansas City to Los Angeles to Manila, a connecting flight down to Cebu. Somewhere over the Pacific, staring out at nothing but dark ocean beneath the wing, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear, but a kind of lightness, like a weight I'd been carrying since that 11 minutes on the kitchen floor had finally been set down. Before we continue with what happened when Harold landed, if you're finding value in this story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Ray met me at the airport in Cebu, 80 years old, and grinning like a man half his age, wearing a linen shirt that had clearly seen better decades. Well, Harold Evans, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Welcome to the rest of your life. The heat hit me first, a thick, wet wall of warmth unlike anything Missouri summers had prepared me for. The noise came second. Motorbikes, vendors calling out prices, a symphony of car horns that seemed to follow no rhythm I could identify. Everything smelled different. Diesel and grilled meat and something sweet and floral I couldn't place, all mixed together in a way that was, somehow, not unpleasant, just entirely foreign. Ray had helped me arrange a small rental house not far from his own, in a quiet residential area outside the main city, and for the first month I will admit I struggled. My body wasn't used to the humidity. My American habits, driving myself everywhere, expecting certain conveniences, had to be relearned in a place that operated on entirely different rhythms. There was a particular Tuesday, about 3 weeks in, when I sat alone in my rented house, the power out again from an afternoon storm, sweat rolling down my back, and I thought, have I made a terrible mistake? I called Linda that Sunday, and for the first time, didn't pretend everything was perfect. It's harder than I expected, I told her. Do you want to come home, Dad? I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, sitting with the question instead of dismissing it out of pride. And the answer, when it came, surprised me with its clarity. No, I said. I want to get better at being here. That's different from wanting to leave. The turning point came from an unlikely source. My housekeeper, a woman named Perla, who Ray had recommended, who came twice a week to help with cleaning and cooking. Perla was maybe 50 years old, sharp-tongued, and entirely unimpressed by my American self-sufficiency. The first time I tried to wave off her help with dinner, insisting I could manage on my own, she looked at me with an expression somewhere between amusement and exasperation. "Sir, you are guest in my country," she said. "Let me take care of you. This is not weakness. This is how we live here." That sentence did something to me I hadn't expected. Back home, needing help had felt like defeat, like evidence for the case my children had already built against my independence. Here, needing help was simply how a community functioned, an ordinary, ungrudging fact of daily life, not a referendum on my worth as a man. Slowly, month by month, small victories accumulated. I learned enough basic Cebuano to greet my neighbors properly, and they lit up every time, correcting my pronunciation with patient laughter rather than pity. I found a physical therapist, half the cost of the one back home, who worked with my hip twice a week and told me, after 4 months, that my mobility had actually improved since I'd arrived. Something about the warm climate being kinder to old joints than a Missouri winter. I made friends, real friends, not just fellow expats clinging to each other out of homesickness, though there were a handful of those too. A retired schoolteacher from Ontario, a widower from Texas who'd been in Cebu 11 years, but also Filipino friends. A tricycle driver named Boye who insisted on driving me to physical therapy every week and refused to let me pay full price. A shopkeeper named Nena who saved the good mangoes for me before they went on the shelf. An entire extended family down the street who invited me to a fiesta after only 2 months of living there, treating me like an uncle rather than a stranger. 6 months in, I planted a small garden behind my rented house. Not okra, that never took to the climate, but tomatoes and something called kangkong that Perla taught me to cook, and a small patch of calamansi that I tended every morning before the worst of the heat set in. I was, slowly, rebuilding a life, not replacing the one I'd had with Doris. Nothing could replace that, and I never wanted it to. But building something new, something entirely mine, in a place where nobody had known me as the frail old man who fell in his kitchen. Here, I was simply Harold, the American who was slowly learning to haggle at the market, who showed up every Sunday at the same little cafe for coffee, who had, against every prediction anyone back home had made, figured out how to live. I want to be honest here, because I promised myself when I decided to tell this story that I wouldn't varnish it into something it wasn't. There were hard nights. There was a Christmas, my first one there, when the loneliness hit so hard I couldn't finish the phone call with my grandchildren without my voice breaking. There were moments, especially early on, when I questioned everything. Whether I'd been rash, whether I'd let pride push me into a decision that comfort should have overruled. I think it's important to say this plainly. Choosing your own life doesn't mean every day of it is easy. Ray told me something in my 3rd month that I've carried with me since. Harold, the goal was never for this to be easy. The goal was for it to be yours. There's a difference between a hard day you chose and a hard day someone else assigned you. I'd lived enough of both by then to know which one I preferred. The homesickness never fully disappeared, if I'm being truthful. I missed my grandchildren's birthdays in person. I missed the specific quality of a Missouri autumn, the smell of leaves burning that you simply cannot replicate near the equator. I missed Doris's grave, which Linda visited for me and sent photographs of, flowers laid at the base of the headstone, a small ritual we maintained across 8,000 miles. But missing something is not the same as regretting a choice. I missed pieces of my old life the way you miss a friend who's moved away, with fondness, not with the desperate ache of someone trapped in the wrong place. 18 months after I left, I flew back to Kansas City for Linda's birthday. I wanted my family to see, with their own eyes, what this life had done for me, not just hear it over a crackling phone line every Sunday. Mark picked me up at the airport, and I watched his face carefully as I walked toward him, moving with more ease than I had in years, tanned from the tropical sun, 20 pounds lighter and considerably stronger from months of physical therapy and long walks I'd never had the mobility for back home. "Dad," he said, staring at me like he was doing arithmetic he couldn't quite make add up. "You look alive," I offered. "I look alive, Mark. That's the word you're looking for." At Linda's birthday dinner, surrounded by my grandchildren, who peppered me with questions about tricycles and mangoes and whether I'd learned to surf, I hadn't, and had no plans to. I watched my daughter's face soften in a way it hadn't since that day in my kitchen with the suitcases. I still worry, she admitted later that night once the kids had gone to bed. I worry every single day, Dad. I know, I said. But Linda, listen to me. You can worry about me from 8,000 miles away, or you can worry about me from down the street. Either way, I need you to understand something. The worry was never going to disappear by putting me somewhere quiet. It was only going to disappear if I actually stopped living. And I'm not ready to do that. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll carry with me for whatever years I have left. You look happier than you have since Mom died. I am, I said, and I meant it completely. Before I flew back to Cebu, Mark pulled me aside. I looked into it, he said, a little sheepishly. The visa program. What it would cost me and Karen if we ever wanted to do something similar someday. I laughed. A real laugh. The kind I hadn't had much occasion for in that house before I left it. Careful, son. Might be contagious. Before we go further, if this story is resonating with you, take a second to make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment letting us know which country you're watching from. There's a particular morning I want to describe to you, because I think it holds the answer to a question I couldn't have answered honestly on the day I found those suitcases in my hallway. It was a Tuesday, nearly 2 years after I first landed in Cebu. Ray and I had taken a short drive to Mactan Island, to a stretch of beach neither of us had visited before, on nothing more than a whim and a decent forecast. I sat on the sand, actual sand, not a folding chair on a porch, but the ground itself, my old joints complaining only mildly, and watched the water. Fishing boats, the kind painted in bright, mismatched colors, drifted along the horizon. Children ran along the shoreline, laughing at something only children find that funny. The sun was warm without being cruel. The breeze carrying salt and the faint smell of someone grilling fish a few hundred yards down the beach. Ray sat beside me, quiet for once, letting me have the moment. I thought about that morning, 2 years earlier, standing in my own bedroom doorway staring at 3 suitcases I hadn't packed. I thought about the laminated folder, the smiling strangers on its cover, the life that had been quietly decided for me in rooms I wasn't invited into. And I thought about Perla's words, "This is not weakness, this is how we live here," and about Boyer refusing my money, and about the fiesta where an entire street of strangers had folded me into their family within 2 months of my arrival, and about the tomatoes and calamansi growing in a garden I'd planted with my own 2 hands in soil 8,000 miles from where I was born. I thought about my grandchildren's questions about surfing, about Linda's face softening at her birthday dinner, about Mark quietly researching a life he'd once called insane. Sitting on that beach, I came to understand something that I don't think you can fully understand until you've lived both versions of the choice, the one handed to you, and the one you make for yourself. Growing old was never the problem. Losing my wife, losing some of my strength, even falling on my own kitchen floor, none of that was the real threat to whatever years I had left. The real threat had been the folder on my kitchen table, the assumption baked into every laminated page that once a man reaches a certain age, his opinion about his own remaining life becomes optional. Aging with dignity doesn't mean refusing help, refusing caution, refusing the people who love you. I still call Linda every Sunday. I still lean on Boyette's arm when the humidity makes my hip ache. I still let Perla take care of dinner more often than my pride would once have allowed. But dignity means something specific, something I don't think I fully understood until I sat on that beach at Mactan. It means being the one who decides, not the only one in the room, not the only voice that matters, but the final one, the one whose name is on the decision, even when the decision is difficult, even when the people who love you are frightened by it. My family packed my bags for a nursing home because they loved me and were scared. I understand that now more fully than I did in the moment, and I've forgiven them for it. Because forgiveness costs less than resentment and buys you back the years resentment would have stolen. But I bought my own ticket to the Philippines because somewhere inside an 82-year-old body that had just spent 11 minutes on a kitchen floor, There was still a man who remembered he got to choose. Ray stood up first, brushing sand off his linen pants, offering me a hand I didn't strictly need but took anyway, because accepting help isn't the same as surrendering your life. "Good beach," he said. "Good life," I answered. And for the first time since Doris passed, I meant those two words with my whole chest. We walked back up the shore together, two old soldiers who'd once measured their courage in different currencies, one in combat, and now, decades later, in the quiet, unglamorous bravery of choosing exactly how to spend whatever days remained. Somewhere behind us, the tide came in over our footprints, the way tides do, erasing the path but never the fact that we had walked it, on our own 2 feet, toward a life we had chosen, and nobody else's laminated folder would ever decide for us again. If you made it this far, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for a decision about your own life that your family didn't understand at first? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like Harold's.